Where are you watching from, and what time is it in your city right now? Keep that time in your head. In this story, the clock refuses to move past 1 minute, and if you notice when it stops, you will understand how the whole business worked. Dusk, a small lake on a rail spur, a dock ladder worn smooth by freight hands. A steam train crawls across the trestle like a slow thought. On the ladder is a young woman in an underdress that belongs to another room, not to water. The fabric is opaque, but it is wet at the hem, and it will cling when she takes the next step. Her left hand wears a ring. That is the first thing the watermen see. It is the wrong hand for a bride, and that detail will matter later when paper tries to claim the opposite. 3 men stand in the lake to their waists, where the bottom turns from planks to mud. They are not guards and not ushers. They are paid to make sure no one drowns and that the photograph looks like a ritual and not a scramble. They work for cash and for rules they made themselves when they took this job. The first rule is that nobody gets pulled under. The second is that no one touches what does not need touching. The third is that the camera decides when the scene ends, not the banker on the shore with the soft hat and the clean shoes. The tall one is named Isaiah. He was a diver on the riverboats before the company sold off the barges. He can hold his breath long enough to fix a chain underwater and long enough to think through a hard decision. The broad one is Caleb. He used to lift crates in the freight shed and now lifts people with a voice, not his hands. He knows how to say steady without raising his tone. The youngest is Jonah. He has an eye for straight lines and will notice if a backdrop sags or a lamp blinds the lens. They signed on as a 3-man crew because they knew they could keep each other honest when the money got odd. On the dock, 2 women from the committee wait in coats that do not match the weather. One fans herself as if she is in a parlor, and the other checks a list, not of prayers, but of names and fees. A pastor holds a small book and stands back from the edge as if the lake might be contagious. The banker with the soft hat does not speak. He watches the light and the train and the ladder and the waterman like a man taking inventory. A camera is set up low near the planks, and its operator has positioned it so the woman, the 3 men, and the last coach of the train will sit in the same frame. He is called Pratt to clients and Pratt to the police if they ever ask. He carries a case lined with felt and a cloth to wipe the lens. Tucked under the cloth is a clock face that always reads 8:55. When the picture is mounted later, a printed mantle and that exact clock will be behind the woman to make the scene look like it happened inside a proper room. That is the trick. The lake is the proof. The clock is the cover, and the paper is the sail. The woman on the ladder is introduced to everyone as a fiancée who wants to start clean. She is neither anonymous nor safe. Her name on the committee sheet will not be the name in the pastor's letter. She was told that proof of modesty will quiet talk before it starts, that a photograph taken under supervision and a letter signed by station will outrun gossip, that a small bond posted at the bank will pay for a printed correction if anyone says otherwise. She was told to think of a hymn she likes. She was told not to shiver too hard, that it reads wrong in a picture. She was told that the men in the water will look away if she asks, and will look toward her if the camera needs a stronger line. Pratt lifts his hand for quiet. The watermen form a shallow arc in front of the ladder so her first step lands into calm. Isaiah says to her, without moving his lips much, that the mud is soft and the second plank slips. So take the right side first. She does what he says. Jonah takes a small step left to balance the frame. Caleb watches her hands and the way her breath speeds when the water reaches her knees. He says, "You're fine," and he says it the way a good porter says, "Careful now," without sounding like a warning. Pratt holds 2 fingers up to count, then drops them and opens the shutter. Oil on the lamp flame thickens for a second and then clears. The train takes another yard of trestle, and the whistle throws a low note across the water. The banker checks his pocket watch, though the watch has nothing to do with the picture and everything to do with the next train. The committee runs a schedule. The woman came down in the ladies' coach at 10:46. At 10:53, she was moved into the quiet car by a porter who did not ask why, because the seat change slip carried committee letterhead. At 10:59, the train slowed at the spur, and the conductor stamped his book at exactly 7 minutes past the hour, as he always does, because he is proud of keeping time even when no one else does. The schedule is tight because the photographer needs 3 plates before the matron's patience runs out, and the watermen do not work past midnight. On the way back to town, the same quiet car will carry a crate that now is empty, and later will hold a rolled backdrop and a brace shaped like the curve of a swan's neck. The woman takes the last step, so both feet are in the water. Pratt asks her to tilt her head a little so the lace on her neckline throws a clean edge, and then he asks her to look at the 3 men and hold their eyes for a count of 3. It is a simple instruction, and it is not simple at all. She tries, and she succeeds, and the picture gathers attention that has nothing to do with doctrine, and everything to do with 3 bodies, and 1 choice, and a ladder that no longer feels like a ladder. Pratt opens the shutter again, and the lamp gives a bright ring across her shoulder, and the water catches it and throws it back. Up on the shore, the matron smiles. This is what she came for, not the water, but the frame. She will mail the 2nd plate to a man who pays for assurance before marriage and for discretion after. A letter of character will go with it, signed by the pastor, and the bond at the bank will be marked with the guardian name that appears on too many bonds to be an accident. If the man asks later whether the woman kept to the line he had in mind, the committee will print a notice that says, of course, signed by station, witnessed by matrons, photographed under proper supervision, and anyone who repeats otherwise shall answer for slander. It will be placed in the church column, not in advertisements, because truth looks better if it is dressed as charity. Isaiah sees something that the matron does not. It is the ring. He has seen rings move from right to left and back again, depending on who pays for the paper. He has seen a retoucher draw a pencil veil higher over a neckline and call it modesty and call it proof. He knows that the wrong detail will kill this whole sale if a man with a sharp eye reads the picture instead of the letter. He shifts again and says quietly to Jonah that the hand with the ring needs to sit higher on the rail for the next plate. Jonah says, "I have it," and he slides 1 palm through the water to mirror her posture so the camera will pull her hand into the light. Caleb says to hold a breath on the count so the shoulders do not rise too fast and read as fear. Pratt calls for plate 3, the short one. The lamp is low now, and everything feels closer. The pastor clears his throat and says it is time to speak a line and then sign a line, which is how he always says it when the committee pays him to be present. The banker steps back so his shoes will not touch wet wood. The matron fans herself once, twice, then rests the fan so it will not appear in the reflection. Pratt counts, and the shutter makes that small scrape that stills a room. The woman looks at the men, and the men hold still, and the last coach rolls into the frame where it belongs. When it is done, the watermen back away first, so no one thinks they are pulling at her. She climbs 2 steps, and the cloth sticks to her thighs, and she does not use the hand with the ring to push the fabric down, because Isaiah has asked her not to. Jonah moves to the right to block the lens from catching 3 faces at once when Pratt pulls the plate. Caleb stands still so the woman can put a hand on his shoulder if she needs to keep her balance. She does not. She climbs to the planks and nods once toward the 3 of them. She will change in a tent the committee keeps for modesty, and she will go back to the quiet car under a shawl that the committee will keep, because props are inventory. What happens next will decide whether this is a story about a clever charity or a machine that launders reputation for a fee. The plate will be printed with a mantle and a clock set to 8:55. The letter will say the woman was known to the committee and of good report. The bond will list a guardian who serves on the bank's benevolence fund and who never appears at a table with a woman's family because the bank does not like its name spoken aloud. The newspaper will run a notice that looks like a letter to the editor. If anyone asks why the water was needed at all, the matron will say baptism and smile without saying who ordained it or who paid for it. Isaiah, Caleb, and Jonah are not theologians and not clerks. They are good at noticing patterns. The clock never moves off 8:55. The ring migrates. The letters are written before the film dries. The same train number carries the same crate month after month, and the conductor always stamps at 7 minutes past, even when the car is nearly empty. They know who signs the receipts for the rented lamps and who signs a different receipt for a corrective notice at the printer on River Street. They could keep quiet and keep being paid. Instead, they have started to keep a ledger of their own. They write the date, the lake, the time the train crept across the trestle, the coach number, the shade of the shawl the matron brought, and whether the woman looked away or looked back when Pratt counted to 3. They do not write the women's names. They write the men's names and the numbers on bank slips when they can see them. On this night, the woman looks back. You can see it in the plate later if you know how to look past the mantle that was never there. Pratt signs a receipt for a crate that has grown heavier by the weight of a wet shawl and an iron brace, and he hands the matron a copy. The banker takes a pledge card that matches the face value of the bond that will be issued at opening bell. The pastor writes a line in a pocketbook. The committee wraps the plates and the clock face and the studio stamp in a towel and lowers them into the case. The watermen stand on the far edge of the dock and shake water from their hands and do not talk until the train pulls out and the lamp is turned down. Caleb says she did not flinch. Jonah says her left hand was steady. Isaiah says he saw the ring catch, and that light will read. Caleb says he does not like the new matron because she talks about purity like it is a purchase. Jonah says he heard the banker tell the pastor that a second plate will cost extra if the client wants an angle that shows no water. Isaiah says the clock on the printed mantle is wrong, and he is tired of being the only one in the room who acts like time is real. They pick up their own odd case, which holds nothing more than towels and a wrench, and they walk the path that follows the spur back toward town. They pass a siding where a crate sits on a handcart. On the corner of the crate is a chalk mark that looks like a single number plus a small circle. Jonah stops and writes that number in his own book. Behind them, the lake is quiet and the dock is empty, and you can almost believe the scene did not happen if not for the wet plank where the woman's foot stood and the print of a sleeve on the ladder where her hand gripped, and the fact that every story like this begins with a time you can say aloud. You told me the time in your city. Here the clock says 8:55, and it never moves. They call it a company because that word keeps people calm. The letterhead says Railroad Purity Company, and the product they sell is not water and not faith. It is a proof packet. One photograph that looks like a ritual, one letter that sounds like character, one bond that pays for silence if anyone talks out of turn. The company runs on a schedule the same way a train does. If you understand the schedule, you understand why the picture always captures the same kind of moment and the same kind of light. A client does not walk in off the street and ask for a certificate. He is invited to a quiet evening in a bank office, dressed to look like a parlor. The gas jets are turned low. The samovar is on, but no one drinks. The banker with the soft hat is suddenly a host with good manners and better memory. A small album lies on the table under a linen cloth. It is not a catalog in the way a store uses the word. It is a comfort device. The album shows lake edges and stairs and mist, and a ladder that appears in 3 different towns under 3 different skies. In each scene, the woman is centered, and the watermen are catchers, not stars. The banker opens the album so the client sees the pattern without feeling lectured. He says, "If talk has started, we can end it. If talk has not started, we can keep it from ever starting." He slides a pledge card across the table and covers the number line with his ring finger, like a teacher guiding a child. The pastor sits near the window and writes a date on a small card. The matron holds the ledger and does not smile. What the client buys has a name. Immersion bond. The document is a guarantee against defamation and desertion. The words are plain. If someone calls a woman unclean, the company will answer in print that she is known to them and kept to good conduct under supervision, with witnesses of station. If a man walks away from a promise, the company will encourage him back to the table with letters and a fee for his trouble, and a notice in the paper of what is expected of a man with a good name. The client looks at the bond face value and at the pledge he just wrote and notices they match. He tells himself he is not buying pressure. He is buying peace. The machine that makes peace has 4 working parts: the rail, the camera, the paper, and the lake. The rail moves everything at night when station clerks are less watchful. The quiet car has curtains and a conductor who stamps at 7 minutes past the hour. A porter who understands discretion walks a woman to that car with a seat change slip from the committee. The camera is Pratt's, heavy and ordinary, with plates he has learned to load in the dark. He always brings 3. 1 to calm a room, 1 to keep, 1 to sell. The paper is split work. The pastor writes the letter, the bank writes the bond, and the printer sets a notice under church and charity that looks like a community voice and reads like a receipt. The lake is the scene because water reads as cleansing in a picture, and because it gives a reason for men to be near a woman without touching her. It is the only place where suggestive becomes proper if you say the right words. On the nights when a client wants more certainty, the matron adds witness names. She offers a package with 2 matrons present, a pastor present for the first plate, a committee seal applied across the corner of the mounted print, so the eye reads certification even though the seal is pressed after the photograph is glued. She is careful to say present and not touch. She is careful to say supervised and not staged. She is careful to say documented and not arranged. The price for this package is more than the first pledge. The client pays because he does not hear the language. He hears the promise. The company's office hours are on paper. The real hours are in the ledger in the matron's bag. Mondays and Thursdays are for St. Ladoga. Tuesdays are for Larch Cove. Saturdays are for the 2 lakes closest to the junction. The book has no names, only initials and amounts and a mark for weather. When fog comes in heavy off the water, Pratt sets his lamp closer to the ladder, and the watermen stand a half step nearer to catch the light. The fog makes the plate read like a secret and also hides the rail line, which the banker prefers. When wind is up, Caleb changes his voice and says, "Hold your breath on 2 and exhale on 3, so the shoulders do not rise at the same time as the splash." He can keep 5 seconds flat with his eyes closed. Jonah watches the lines when the woman grips the rail and shifts her weight. If the camera needs a clean angle toward the ring, he moves a half shoe length left and the frame tightens. Isaiah watches where the mud shelf drops and says out loud to the ladder hand, "Right foot first, left hand high, no hurry." The client never sees any of this. He sees only the album and the bond and the letter. If he asks for his own assurance before any vow, the matron tells him there is a discreet way to handle that. She shows him a sample cabinet card with the woman half turned and the water cropped close. No words are printed on the back, only a studio stamp and a faint crescent where an air bubble in the rubber makes the S lighter than the other letters. The client nods because he does not know that everywhere the studio travels, the same small crescent appears. He thinks it is a brand mark. It is a breadcrumb the company forgot to sweep. The bank uses clean arithmetic to dirty the trail. Each bond lists a guardian. It is always the same name. The banker says that is efficient stewardship. The reserve book in the vault shows disbursements coded as witness honoraria, pastoral notes, and quiet. Quiet is the largest single line each month. Quiet pays for newsprint and for a small stack of anonymous letters that begin with "to those concerned" and end with words like impropriety and unfounded. The claims window posts nothing. The public never sees a case. The entire machine works only if shame stays private and money moves smoothly. It is an ugly kind of elegance. The woman on the ladder is not a fool. Some come with their mothers, some alone, some with a man who plans to marry and wants his own nerves settled by a record he can hold. Some arrive with the matron and a suitcase and say they want a change of town and a fresh book. The watermen learn quickly which kind they are dealing with by the way a woman steps from plank to water. The ones who watch Isaiah's mouth for the next instruction are not ready. The ones who ask Caleb if this will hurt and do not laugh after are carrying other pains. The ones who meet Jonah's eyes and hold them for the count do not need to be told how a picture steals doubt. No one tells jokes on the dock. People remember every word said there. Between jobs, the company runs a second business that pays for the first. The banker and matron maintain a private catalog for a circle of clients who say they want to help and mean they want to choose from proofs. These men are told they are patrons of virtue, preserving good names from careless talk. They write larger pledges and receive, in return, advance cabinet cards showing women already processed and ready for presentation. These cards never carry real names. They carry letters and dates and a notation that a bond is in place and witnesses of station will answer if any man makes trouble. No one uses the word purchase. The banker says placement, and the matron says arrangement, and the pastor says guidance. Pratt hates this part, but does not say so where anyone can hear. He says nothing to the waterman except that on catalog nights he prefers strong lamp oil and 3 plates ready because the banker gets nervous if he has to wait between exposures. Isaiah, Caleb, and Jonah do not see the album in the bank. They see the faces when the plates dry on Pratt's line. They notice that the women who receive the most inquiries later are the same ones whose pictures held eye contact at the ladder. They notice that the women who look away end up in the file with longer letters and larger bonds. They do not know the names or the cities, but they keep a book of plate numbers and train times and a plain description that would sound like nothing in a courtroom and everything to a jury. Woman looked back. Wrong hand ring. Pastor left after first plate. Matron Whitcomb present. Bank hat present. On a Thursday, the company runs a demonstration for a man with a business in timber. He arrives with a smile and a story about slander in his town and asks questions that tell Isaiah he cares more about a picture he can show to others than about the woman he names. The matron arranges a session at Larch Cove. Pratt positions the camera so the ladder and the train and the men form a clean line. The woman is young and does not speak. She listens to the count and gets it right the first time. The client watches from the reeds with the banker, which is against the waterman's rules, but the price is high, and the matron insists. Isaiah stares at the client the way a man watches a storm moving across a field. He does not like the man's hands. He does not like that the banker does not tell the man to step back. The plate lands anyway. Jonah places a towel over the crate and marks it with a chalk code he and Isaiah use to find the right box later if anything is questioned. Caleb positions himself so the woman can leave the water with her shoulders level, because a picture read by a stranger cannot be allowed to carry a tremor. Back in town, the company processes the film. The pastor writes the letter. The bank issues the bond. The printer sets the notice in type. The matron places a cabinet card in the album. The client receives his copy by courier. The watermen receive their pay in coin, not paper, as they demanded when they started. The system should be finished. It is not. The timberman sends a note 2 days later to say the second plate does not show enough of the woman's face and that he would like a replacement free of charge. The matron says the company does not give second exposures to clients for free. The banker says if he pays once, others will ask. The pastor says the letter he already wrote will suffice. Pratt says the lamp burned uneven, and he will not send a plate that reads as fear. Isaiah says, "Put me in the room when you answer this man." No one invites him. There is a second book inside this company, and it belongs to a clerk at the bank with the kind of neatness that makes managers feel safe. Her name is Ruth Caldwell. She records bond numbers and witness names and payouts. She files letters by town and date and thread. She never meets a client and never sees a lake. She knows something is wrong only because the same guardian name is written on bond after bond, and because she has to ink over a looped capital B so often that the pen has cut a groove in the ledger paper. She asks the banker in the soft hat if the bank should distribute responsibility. He says stability prevents confusion. She asks the matron in a private voice if a lady ever receives her own photograph. The matron answers that a proper woman needs no proof beyond her conduct and the testimony of station. That night, Ruth copies the guardian line and 3 signatures onto onion skin and writes the phrase, "wrong hand ring" in the margin, because her sister married across the state, and she remembers the way people look at a left hand in a church. She places the copy in an envelope and writes no return on the back. 2 weeks later, a client at the Timberman's Club brags that the company can make a woman new between 2 lakes. The phrase is ugly and wrong, and it sticks. Isaiah hears it when he is hauling a scow rope at the freight yard. Caleb hears it at the depot when a porter jokes about a night train with curtains down. Jonah hears it at the printer when he is picking up oil, and the foreman says if the committee wants a run of blanks again, he will need a cash deposit. The three men meet at a boarding house kitchen table and put their notebooks side by side. Separate pages make more sense when you see them together. Train number, stamp time, lake, matron present, banker present, pastor present, ring hand, look held, look away, bond face value guessed by size of pledge card envelope. The story hardens into something a judge could hold. Isaiah says one more job, and then we move. Caleb says we set our own clock, and not theirs. Jonah says the lamp and the case go in one wagon, and the banker in another when they come for us. A week later, the banker hosts another evening in the bank office dressed like a parlor. He warms his hands around a cup he does not drink. He sells a pledge. He promises that the company will end talk before it starts. He turns a page in the album. The client nods. In the reflection of the gas jet on the window, you can see, if you know where to look, 4 shapes. The banker, the matron, the pastor, and another person standing still with a hat in his hands. It is Pratt holding the felt-lined case. The lake is not in the room. It does not need to be. The company does not move water. It moves paper. The only people who can stop it are the 3 who stand in water and count to 3, while a woman holds her breath and a train crosses a trestle behind her, and a clock that no one can see already reads 8:55. Isaiah starts keeping the ledger on real paper the morning after the timberman session. He buys a school notebook from a druggist who minds his own business, tears out the front leaf, and writes 3 headings in block letters: time, people, proof. He does not use names for the women. He uses short descriptions he can read aloud, without shame. He puts plate numbers next to each entry and a mark for where the train sat on the trestle when the shutter opened. Caleb adds a column for behavior that only he can fill. Shoulders even or lifted, breath held on 2 or 3, eyes steady or flicked away. Jonah adds a column marked tells and begins listing every repeatable mistake the company makes. Wrong hand ring. Pencil veil drawn higher. Bubble nick in the studio stamp S. Mantle clock at 8:55 in a room that had no mantle. They do not plan to take the company to court. They plan to stop the worst clients from using proof packets to lean on women who have already done more than enough to satisfy any fair mind. That means building something cleaner than rumors. The ledger will stay simple enough to survive hostile questions. Dates from the depot chalkboard, train numbers, conductor stamp times, coach curtains, distance between lamp and ladder measured by Jonah's stride. Pratt does not know about the ledger, but he notices that the 3 men have stopped taking their pay at the dock and now collect at the boarding house kitchen like a crew on a contract. The first break comes from the clerk at the bank. Her name is Ruth Caldwell, and her neatness is the kind that chafes managers. She copies the Guardian line from 3 immersion bonds onto onion skin in her boarding house room and slips the copies in an envelope under the boarding house door with a note that reads, "Only look at the loop on the B." Isaiah opens it and understands. The loop on the capital B in the bond matches the loop on the capital B in the pastor's letters and the studio receipts. 3 offices, 1 hand. Caleb says the company will call that efficiency. Jonah says the jury will call it coordination if someone explains it in simple words. A week later, a man in a gray coat asks the matron for a second session with the same woman because the first photographs did not make him comfortable. He says comfortable the way a butcher says tender. The matron says the company does not repeat out of consideration for a lady's dignity. The man replies that his pledge was generous and that a second plate is the least the company can do to make a future household secure. The banker does not say no. He says if a second plate is to be made, it must be done before the schedule turns because fog season will ruin the line. Pratt hates every part of the conversation, but he packs his case and oils the seal press and tells the watermen they are going to St. Ladoga again on a night without much moon. They arrive to find the woman already on the dock in a dark shawl, not the bright committee cloth that looks good on a cabinet card. She is alone. The matron is late. The banker is not present. The pastor stands with his hat in his hands and says they will do this quickly. Isaiah says nothing. Caleb says we do not work without a matron present. Jonah points at the train and says we do not shoot with a client in the reeds. Pratt lowers his case and looks at the woman. Her jaw is set the way people hold themselves when a dentist works without chloroform. He says to the pastor that the company can either follow its own rules or find another photographer. The pastor answers that the rules exist to serve the greater good and that this second exposure will prevent worse talk later. He speaks like a man who believes paper will always win. The client steps out of the reeds and shows his face to the lamp as if this is a negotiation and not a setup. He says he wants her turned more, with less of the water. Isaiah steps between the man and the ladder and says, "We do not take orders on the dock." Caleb puts a hand on the ladder rail because the woman's fingers have tightened there. Jonah sets the lamp lower to flatten the glare because he will not let fear read as sin in the plate. Pratt says last plate, and only if the matron signs the session book. He does not raise his voice. He does not move his feet. The man in gray laughs and says the matron will sign whatever the bank tells her to sign. He takes another step. Caleb says to the woman, "We are with you for the count, and then you are out." She nods once. She does not look at the man. Jonah positions himself in the water so that if the client takes another step, he will have to wade. Isaiah says to Pratt, "Short exposure, keep her hand with the ring high on the rail." Pratt lifts his hand and drops it. The shutter opens and closes. The lamp gives a clean edge and dies back. The client says, "Let us do it again." Isaiah says no. The pastor says the committee will hear of this. Pratt says, "Let them." Caleb says to the woman, "Up on 2." She climbs. Jonah moves to block the lens again so the plate does not collect her face with a stranger next to it. The matron arrives at a run while they are packing. She has the ledger tucked to her ribs under her coat. She looks at the client and at the woman and at the 3 men and understands at once that she is late to a room that belonged to her. She says, "Who authorized this?" The pastor says the bank and lowers his eyes. The client says his pledge buys consideration. The matron says consideration runs both ways and that the session is over. She takes the woman's elbow and calls for the quiet car by habit, then realizes the schedule is off and the next train will not slow at the spur. She has to walk the woman along the path past the freight shed to the junction. Isaiah goes with them without asking permission because the rules say no one walks alone after a shoot with a client who uses that voice. Caleb follows some paces back to catch anyone who trails them. Jonah carries the case and a pocket of chalk. Ruth's second envelope contains something more dangerous than a loop. It holds a printer's proof for a church column piece titled, "A Lady of Known Standing Speaks." At the bottom margin is the same air bubble flaw in the S that appears on the back of every studio card. Jonah holds the proof up to the lamp and lines the crescent flaw against a studio stamp he stole from Pratt's wastebasket. The fit is exact. Pratt looks at it and swears under his breath because he thought the press notices were typeset new each time. Ruth's note on the envelope flap says the printer keeps a standing plate and swaps only names and dates. Isaiah says that means the committee prints the correction before the shoot, and if they can print a correction before the shoot, the bond is not a shield. It is a price. The watermen meet Pratt in the boarding house kitchen and tell him they are done working for the company unless the rules return. Pratt says the rules will not return while the money keeps coming. He is not defending the company. He is telling the truth. He says if the three of you are planning something, plan it with dates and times and things a sheriff can carry. Isaiah slides the ledger across the table. Pratt reads. He is a practical man who knows what a judge likes to see. He says, take the next job that looks like an easy plate and make it a hard one. He says he can miss a screw on the camera back and claim it needs fixing while someone else walks into the bank vault with a reason to pull the reserve book. He says a man he knows at the yard can weigh a crate without waking the depot master. Jonah says we will need a letter that asks the right question. Ruth writes it and signs it as a request for reconciliation of premiums to disbursements. No one in the front office reads beyond the word reconciliation if the paper carries the bank crest. The trigger comes from a pattern Caleb has been watching for weeks. The matron nods to the conductor in the same small rhythm every time the quiet car is on schedule. 2 taps, pause, 1 tap. On nights when the banker is nervous and the client is watching, the rhythm shifts to 1, pause, 2. That is when they push for a second plate or a closer angle. Caleb teaches the rhythm to Ruth when she passes their table for coffee. She writes it down as if it were a hymn and says she can use it in the office to know which envelopes to copy before the teller sacks them for the vault. On the night of the 4th immersion, the weather cooperates without being asked. Mist rides the lake low, and the train is late by a minute that will make a manager grind his teeth. The client is new to them and wears the kind of cologne men buy when they are certain they will not have to apologize for it. The matron has her ledger and her fan. The banker has his soft hat. The pastor has his sentences. Pratt has 3 plates and a camera screw that is not going to catch on the first try. The woman on the ladder is tired and focused and has agreed to the session because a letter arrived at her boarding house with a line that said there will be no more talk after this and a bond number that frightened her when she saw how big it was. Isaiah is at the mud shelf. Jonah is at the lamp. Caleb is at the ladder rail. They have already left a chalk mark on the crate at the junction and a note under a door at the printer that says, "Hold the standing plate for 1 hour." The banker lifts his chin like a man who believes all plans are his. The matron taps twice, pauses, and taps once. The conductor on the trestle stamps his book at 7 past. Pratt opens the case and says his back screw will not hold. The banker says we do not have time for this. Pratt says then perhaps we should not proceed. The client says, proceed. The matron says we proceed with rules. Ruth will be waiting at the bank door with a reconciliation letter the teller cannot ignore. A friend with a scale will be waiting at the freight shed with a reason to weigh a crate that grew heavier by an iron brace and a wet shawl. A printer will hold a standing plate until someone arrives who knows a flaw in the S when he sees it. The water is cold, and the clock that nobody can see already reads 8:55. The screw on Pratt's camera buys 3 minutes, which is all the plan ever needed. He calls for a small screwdriver, pats his coat as if he forgot it, and keeps his hand on the bellows so no one tries to hurry him by grabbing the instrument. The client shifts in the reeds and asks how long this will take. Caleb answers without looking up that pictures taken in a rush read like lies. The matron taps twice, pauses, and taps once. The banker checks his pocket watch and tells the pastor to ready his line. Isaiah is in the water at the mud shelf. Jonah is at the lamp. The woman is on the ladder with her hand on the rail, ring catching the light where Pratt asked her to keep it. Ruth walks into the bank on time with her reconciliation letter folded, so the crest shows first. The clerk at the front desk sees the word reconciliation and the bank crest and does what clerks do when a paper looks routine and official. He fetches a book and carries it to a side table so the person with the letter can see numbers and not feel managed. Ruth says softly that she will need the reserve disbursement pages that match these bond numbers. She lays down onion skin with 2 bond numbers already copied. The clerk turns to the monthly pages and puts a finger on 3 lines: witness honoraria, pastoral notes, quiet. Ruth does not smile. She asks for the previous month. The same 3 lines sit in the same order with the same totals. She asks for the month before that and writes down the totals and the guardian line at the top because the same name appears again and again. When the clerk turns to fetch a blotter, she lifts the corner of the page long enough to slide a second onion skin underneath and rub the crest with a pencil so the die nick prints through. She returns the page, sets down her letter, and says that her office will require a stamped copy by end of day. At the freight shed, a yardman named Sloan rolls a crate onto a scale with one hand and keeps the other on the brake, as if this were an ordinary piece of freight that could break a wheel if it shifts. The chalk mark Jonah left on the crate face looks like a number and a small circle. Sloan drops the beam, reads the pointer, and nods. He writes the weight and the time and a case number on a strip of paper and slides it into a pocketbook. He is not paid to ask why a crate that smelled of dry wood in the afternoon now smells like wet cloth and camphor. He is paid to make a note that he can go to the stand with if anyone says the beam lies. At the printer on River Street, a boy with ink on his knuckles holds a chase full of type under the lamp for a man who says he is here for a proof. The boy points to a plate that looks nothing like movable letters. It is a metal sheet, shiny on the edges, with a church column piece etched into it. A lady of known standing speaks. The man, he told the boy his name was Mr. Gray because Pratt did not want his own name said, runs a finger over the curve of the S in studios on the backproof Ruth sent, and then over the curve of the S on the standing plate. There is a pale crescent in both where an air bubble left a flaw when the rubber stamp was made. The boy says his foreman keeps that plate active to save time. Names change, type does not. Gray asks if he can pull a blind impression without ink. The boy says yes and slides a sheet under the roller. The blind impression carries the crescent the same way the stamp does. Gray leaves with the dry proof under his coat and tells the boy to keep the plate on the bench for an hour because the pastor said there might be a scripture change. The boy believes him because adults often say scripture when they want the press to wait. Back at the lake, Pratt says the screw has seated. He opens the case, checks the ground glass, and says to the woman that this will be the short plate. Isaiah says, right foot first, shoulders level. Caleb says, hold on 2, exhale on 3. Jonah lowers the lamp a finger width to clear glare from her cheek. The train takes the trestle at a slow notch. The conductor stamps at 7 past the hour, because he always does. The client in the reed says, turn her more and use less water. Isaiah steps to the right enough to block the sight line. Pratt calls the count and drops the shutter. The plate takes the ring and the light, and the 3 faces in water holding still, and the last coach with its curtains down. The pastor says, and now the line and the signature. The matron nods to the banker. The banker says, "We proceed to the office." Ruth crosses the street with 2 onion skins in her sleeve and 1 blind rubbing in her pocket. She does not run. She breathes in the door of the printer's shop and thanks the boy for his care with Scripture. She signs a copy request in a name that is not hers and watches him slide the plate into a drawer with others. She marks the drawer number on the back of her glove with a hairpin scratch because ink would smear. She leaves before the foreman returns. She walks to the boarding house kitchen and lays the proofs on the table between a ledger with mud on its corners and a pocketbook with a strip of paper tucked under the flap. Sloan enters by the back and sets his pocketbook beside Isaiah's ledger. He says only, "The crate grew by 9 since this afternoon." He points to the time he made the first read and the time he made the second, and the stamp mark that proves the scale was balanced both times. Jonah says that is a brace, a wet shawl, and a folded backdrop. Caleb says that is what the company calls modesty. Ruth slides her pencil rubbings across to Pratt. He puts the rubbing next to a studio stamp taken from the back of a cabinet card that the matron left on a chair. The die nick sits in the same place on both. He opens his mouth and closes it again because some anger is not worth spending in the room if you want to keep your hand steady. They do not go to the sheriff. They go to the judge who sits late on Thursdays because he likes to clear his docket before the market opens Friday. His name is Harrow. He does not allow stories at the beginning. He asks for a time and a proof, and a person who can swear to both. Isaiah gives the time and holds the ledger. Sloan gives the weight and holds the beam slip. Ruth gives the reserve totals and the guardian line and holds the onion skins up to the light. Pratt gives the blind proof and shows the crescent in the S and the match to the studio stamp. Jonah says the lamp and the frame and the ring position were arranged so the plate would show what words can hide. Caleb says the matron's tap pattern tells a conductor when to take the quiet car, and the judge asks him to tap it out on the table. He does. The 2 taps, the pause, the 1 tap sound like a man knocking his wedding ring on wood. Harrow looks at the banker's crest on the paper and says, "Where is the guardian?" Ruth says the name, and Harrow repeats it and writes 1 sentence an officer can carry. The company does not get the luxury of learning about the order at home. A deputy stands at the printers and tells the foreman to leave the drawers as they are. Another deputy stands at the bank and asks for the reserve book. A third walks into the pastor's office and asks for all letters with the phrase known to us of good report. The matron meets the deputy at her door with her ledger already in her hands. She does not try to hide it. She is many things, but she is not a fool about paper. The banker is not at his desk. He is at the lake path with his soft hat in his hand and a plan for a second exposure he thinks he can push through if he speaks over the 3 men and moves the schedule by 1 minute, as if time belonged to him. Pratt is already packing the case when the banker steps onto the dock. The client says, "We are not done." Pratt says the session ended when the plate landed. The pastor says we should not quarrel in front of a lady. Isaiah says the rule is no second plate after the count. The banker says the committee authorized a second plate. Caleb says the committee's ledger will not match that sentence in a courtroom. The banker raises his voice for the first time that night. Jonah turns the lamp so the beam sits on the banker's shirt front and not on the woman's face. The woman climbs 1 step and then another and does not look at the man in the reeds. She knows now what her choice was worth to these men, and she will not give them a second count. Boots hit gravel on the path. Not a posse. 2 deputies. One holds a paper Harrow wrote. The other holds nothing because he knows what a hand on a holster does to a room with wet wood and a lamp with a wobbly base. The deputy with the paper reads aloud, "Deliver to the court within the hour the bond register of the reserve account, the standing plate used for corrective notices, and any studio stamp employed to mark backs of proofs." He does not raise his voice. He turns his head to include the banker, the matron, the pastor, and Pratt. He looks finally at Isaiah and Caleb and Jonah and says, "Are you the men who stand in water?" Isaiah says, "We are." The deputy says, "Then you will stand tomorrow and say what time the train stamped and where the ring sat." Caleb says, "We will." Jonah says, "I will bring the lamp if the court has a dark corner." The banker tries to take a step past the deputy as if orders are for other people. The deputy puts a hand out and says, "Not tonight." The client in the reeds does not speak. He leaves the way a man leaves a table he did not pay for and will not admit he could not. The pastor lowers his head and says he will provide his letters at the hour named. The matron looks at the woman and says, "Do you want me to ride with you back to town?" The woman says no, and she says it without anger. Pratt wraps the plates and closes his case without rushing. He asks the woman if she wants her face cropped close on the second print. She says, "Leave it as it is." She will not erase the water to make someone else comfortable. Harrow sits in chambers and lets the room do work. He sets the blind proof beside the onion skin rubbings and lays Sloane's strip of paper on top with the crate weight and the time and the case number. He places the bank book where the Dynick shows in the crest and lines the loop on the capital B up with the loop on the pastor's signature on a letter of character that uses the phrase known to us. He does not give a speech. He writes 3 lines and signs each. The first seizes the reserve account to prevent further disbursements under quiet until a hearing. The second orders the printer to turn over the standing plate and all impressions for the last year. The third orders the studio to deliver its stamps and the last 50 backs it marked. He adds a note with a pen that scratches. The court will consider whether the sale of a reputation by means of staged rights, concealed logistics, and pre-printed corrections constitutes fraud. He hands the orders to the deputy, who likes to walk, and tells him to be precise. By morning, the printer has handed the plate to the court clerk and accepted a receipt that will keep him from losing his shop. The bank has let the reserve book go, and the clerk who loved neatness is the one who carried it down the stairs. The pastor sits with his hat in his lap and answers every question with a date and a phrase and a small, tired truth. The matron puts her ledger on the table and moves her finger down a column to show when rules were followed and when they were bent. She does not protect the banker with her language. She protects the women by telling the plain version. The client in the gray coat does not appear. His name is in the ledger and will live there when people tell this story. Harrow does not try the case that day. He proves a pattern and stops the machine. He says the company will not conduct any more immersions. He says any bond issued under the name of the guardian printed here is suspended until the court can examine the disbursements under quiet. He says any correction notice must be labeled advertisement and must carry the name of the paying party. He says photographs mounted with seals pressed after the fact will be marked accordingly in the file. He tells Pratt he will return his camera when the stamp backs are counted. He tells Sloane to keep his beam true. He tells Ruth that her onion skins will be copied into the record and returned. He tells the watermen that if anyone asks what they did at the lakes, they should say they kept people from drowning and counted for a living. On the dock that night, There is no lamp. The ladder dries. The rails hum with a freight that does not slow, and the conductor stamps at 7 past out of habit. The woman who stood on the second rung is in a kitchen 2 streets off the square, dry dress, hair pinned, breath finally even. The matron writes her a receipt that says nothing about water and everything about paper. Ruth leaves the boarding house with her pencil behind her ear and a letter in her pocket she will not need now. Sloane wipes the beam and sets the weight to 0 because order feels like a prayer in a town that just learned what quiet costs. Isaiah closes the ledger on a line that reads, 4th immersion, short exposure, ring hand high, train late by 1. Caleb folds a towel and says the rule held. Jonah picks a splinter from his palm and says the plate will read. The clock people like to print on a false mantle will still say 8:55 when anyone looks at it. The difference is that now the time belongs to the room and not to the men who sold it.